Picture this. One man walks into a city that had governed itself for nearly 500 years, and by the time he's done, the Roman Republic is a corpse walking. Julius Caesar didn't storm the Senate with an army on day one. He dismantled the Republic piece by piece, using its own rules against it, and half of Rome cheered him on. If you want to understand how democracies really die, not with a bang, but with applause, subscribe right now and hit that like button, because this story is going to change how you see every strong man who ever came after him. And trust me, once you see the pattern, you'll never unsee it. But before we get to how it all burned down, you need to understand what was actually there to burn. For centuries, Rome governed itself without a king, and that was the whole point. The Romans had a memory that ran deep and dark, the memory of tyranny. Generations before Caesar, they had thrown out their last king, Tarquin the Proud, and swore they would never kneel to one man again. That fear of kings wasn't just politics, it was sacred. It was baked into the Roman soul. To even want a crown was to become an enemy of everything Rome stood for. So they built a system designed to make sure no single person could ever seize total control. At the top sat not one leader, but 2 consuls, elected every single year, each with the power to veto the other. If one tried to overreach, the other could shut him down cold. Power was split on purpose, and it was temporary on purpose. A year in charge, and then you stepped down. Below them, or rather beside them, sat the Senate, hundreds of aristocrats, the old wealthy families who carried the weight of tradition and experience. They didn't technically make the laws, but their authority was immense. When the Senate spoke, Rome listened. And then there were the assemblies, where the ordinary citizens gathered to vote, to elect officials, and to make their voices heard. It was messy. It was full of shouting and backroom deals and rivalries. But it worked. For nearly 500 years, this balance of consuls, senate, and citizens kept any one man from becoming a king. It was one of the most successful political experiments the ancient world had ever seen. And then the cracks started to show. The problem wasn't Caesar. Not yet. The problem was that the Republic had grown far too big for the system that built it. Rome had conquered a Mediterranean empire, and all that conquest came flooding home in ways nobody had planned for. Rivers of wealth poured into the pockets of the rich, while the small farmers who had once been the backbone of Rome watched their world collapse. Here's how it happened. When a farmer left to fight in Rome's endless wars, his land often fell into ruin, and the rich swooped in to buy it up cheap. Those wealthy landowners then worked the fields with armies of slaves, captured in war and dirt cheap to feed. The ordinary Roman citizen simply couldn't compete with free labor, so the poor drifted into the city, landless, jobless, and angry. A massive, restless crowd with nothing to lose. Meanwhile, something even more dangerous was shifting underneath it all. The soldiers. Roman armies used to fight for Rome, for the state, for the Republic itself. But as the wars dragged on and generals started rewarding their men with land and loot, those soldiers began to look to their commanders for everything. Their loyalty quietly shifted away from the Senate and toward the man who signed their paychecks and promised them a future. And once armies belong to generals instead of the state, the whole game changes. The old constitution was already breaking. The rules were written for a small city-state, not a sprawling empire drowning in inequality, armed with private armies. Caesar didn't create these fractures. He was born into them. He simply understood, better than anyone, how to force his hand into every crack until the whole thing split apart. But he wasn't the first to try. To understand Caesar, you have to meet the two men who showed him exactly how it could be done. The first was Marius. A brilliant general and a political reformer, Marius did something that seemed harmless, even smart at the time. He opened up the army to the poor, men who owned no land, who had nothing. Before him, you needed property to serve. He threw those doors wide open, and suddenly the poorest men in Rome had a path to glory and reward. It sounds noble, but it turned the army into something new and terrifying. A personal weapon. These desperate men owed everything to their general, not to Rome. Marius had unknowingly built the machine that would one day crush the Republic. The second man was far darker. Sulla. Once Marius's ally, then his deadly rival, Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his army on Rome itself. He turned Roman legions against the Roman capital, something no one had ever dared. And when he won, he made himself dictator. And he did something that froze the blood of every Roman. He posted lists, public lists of citizens to be legally murdered, their property seized, their families destroyed. It was called proscription. If your name was on that list, you were a dead man walking, and killing you was perfectly legal. Rome ran red, and the message was carved into the city's memory. Raw power, unchecked, could do anything it wanted. And watching all of this, the armies, the marches, the killing lists, the total collapse of the old rules, was a young man. Ambitious, brilliant, and taking notes. A boy from an old noble family, learning firsthand exactly what one determined man could seize if he was bold enough to reach for it. That boy was Julius Caesar, and he was about to become far more dangerous than either of them. He was born in the year 100 BC into a family with a glittering name and an empty purse. The Julii claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, an ancestry so ancient and prestigious it bordered on the divine. But prestige doesn't pay the bills. By the time Caesar was growing up, his noble family had faded into genteel poverty, living in a rough, working-class neighborhood of Rome. Imagine an aristocrat with a royal-sounding surname, stuck renting a cramped apartment in a bad part of town. That was young Caesar, dripping with pedigree, starved of cash. That combination is important, because it forged a man who was both entitled and hungry. He believed deep in his bones that greatness was his birthright. But he also knew he'd have to fight and scheme for every inch of it. And his first real test came almost immediately, when he found himself staring down the most dangerous man in Rome. Remember Sulla, the dictator with the killing lists? Well, when Caesar was still just a teenager, he'd married a woman named Cornelia, the daughter of one of Sulla's greatest enemies. Sulla, now the absolute master of Rome, gave the young man a simple command: divorce her. It was the safe move, the obvious move. Everyone bent to Sulla. To defy him was to invite death. Caesar refused. Think about that. A teenage boy with no power, no army, no protection, looking directly at a tyrant who murdered people for sport, and saying no. Caesar had to flee Rome and go into hiding. His family and Rome's priesthood begged Sulla to spare him. Eventually, the dictator relented, but with a warning that has echoed through history. Sulla is said to have looked at the boy and remarked that in this one young Caesar, he saw many a Marius. In other words, watch out for this one. He's more dangerous than he looks. He'll be the death of us all. The old tyrant saw it. He looked at a defiant kid and recognized a future predator. and he let him live anyway. But Caesar's boldness wasn't limited to politics. There's a story from his young manhood that tells you everything about the man he was becoming. While traveling across the sea, he was captured by pirates who demanded a ransom. When they told him the amount they wanted, Caesar was reportedly insulted. He told them they had no idea who they'd captured, and he demanded they raise the ransom to a higher figure. He essentially told his kidnappers they were underpricing him. For weeks he lived among these pirates as a prisoner, but he didn't act like one. He joined their games. He read them his poems and speeches, and when they didn't applaud, he called them illiterate savages to their faces. He joked, laughed, and casually promised them that once he was free, he would come back and crucify every last one of them. The pirates thought it was hilarious. They thought he was a charming, cocky young man making empty threats. He wasn't joking. The moment his ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar raised a fleet, hunted down every one of those pirates, and had them crucified, exactly as he'd promised. That's the ruthless charm that defined him. He could make you laugh, make you like him, and then destroy you completely, all while smiling. It's a quality you'll recognize in a certain kind of leader throughout history, the man everyone underestimates until it's far too late. So how does a charming, broke aristocrat climb to the top of the most powerful state on earth? The answer, in a word, was debt. Staggering, mountainous, suffocating debt. Rome's political system had a hidden trap. To climb the ladder of offices, the path every ambitious man had to walk, you had to spend money you often didn't have, and not a little. You had to throw lavish public games for the masses, gladiator fights, spectacles, feasts. You had to bribe voters, fund your campaigns, and grease every palm in the city. Caesar spent on a scale that stunned even Rome. He borrowed colossal sums from the richest men in the city, gambling everything on his own future. If he failed to reach the top, his creditors would destroy him. He was, in modern terms, betting the entire farm on himself and going millions into the red to do it. It was like a politician today taking out impossible loans to fund the flashiest campaign anyone had ever seen. Free entertainment for everyone, gifts, spectacle, knowing that if he lost, he'd be ruined forever. But if he won, the whole treasury would be his to plunder. And Caesar kept winning. He climbed office by office, buying the love of the crowd with borrowed money and dazzling everyone with his charisma. But he knew that charm and debt alone wouldn't be enough. To truly seize power, he needed allies, powerful ones. So he engineered one of the most consequential backroom deals in all of history. There were two other titans in Rome at the time. The first was Pompey, Rome's greatest general, a war hero adored by the people and the soldiers, a man who had conquered the East and stood as the most celebrated military figure of the age. The second was Crassus, quite simply the richest man in Rome, a financial giant whose wealth was so vast it's almost impossible to calculate. The man who had crushed the famous slave revolt of Spartacus. Caesar's genius was seeing that these three forces, his own popularity, Pompey's military might, and Crassus's endless money, could combine into something unstoppable. In secret, the three men formed an alliance we now call the First Triumvirate. It was not an official office. It had no legal standing. It was simply three of the most powerful men in the world agreeing to carve up the republic between them and back each other's ambitions. Think of it as 3 billionaires and generals meeting privately and deciding they, and not the elected government, would run the country from the shadows. The Senate, the assemblies, the whole magnificent machinery of the Republic. It still existed on paper, but real power now flowed through this private pact. The rules of Rome still stood, but 3 men had quietly agreed to bend them all. This was the moment the Republic's spine began to crack, not in a battle, but in a private arrangement between allies. With this backing, Caesar reached the consulship, the very top. And when his year in office ended, he claimed his prize: command of a Roman army and a province in the north. He was heading to a wild, unconquered land the Romans called Gaul, roughly modern-day France and Belgium. And it was here that Caesar transformed from an ambitious politician into a living legend. And a mass killer on a scale that's hard to comprehend. For 8 years, Caesar waged relentless war across Gaul. The numbers are staggering, and by his own accounts and ancient sources, the toll was catastrophic. Historians estimate that his campaigns killed around 1 million people and enslaved another 1 million. Entire tribes were wiped out. Cities were besieged and starved. Whole populations were sold into slavery, marched off in chains to be worked to death or sold in Rome's markets. By modern standards, it was genocide, a systematic conquest that drenched a continent in blood. And yet, back in Rome, it made Caesar a god among men. The wealth he seized was almost beyond imagination. He used it to pay off his crushing debts, and then to buy even more influence, showering gold on the people of Rome, funding more games, more building projects, more supporters. The broke aristocrat was now one of the wealthiest men alive. But the money wasn't even the most dangerous thing he gained. It was the army. Those 8 years of brutal warfare forged his legions into something terrifying, hardened, experienced, and utterly devoted. These weren't soldiers of the Roman state anymore. They were Caesar's men. He had led them, fed them, enriched them, and shared their hardships. He knew many by name. He was said to call them not soldiers, but comrades. They would follow him anywhere. They would, quite literally, march on their own capital if he asked. Marius had invented this kind of personal army decades earlier. Caesar had now perfected it. And here's the part that feels shockingly modern. Caesar understood that winning the war wasn't enough. You had to win the story. So throughout his conquest, he wrote his own account of the campaign, his famous Commentaries on the Gallic War. He wrote it cleverly, in the third person, describing himself with cool, heroic detachment, as if a neutral observer were simply recording the brilliant deeds of the great general Caesar. He sent these dispatches home to be read and circulated in Rome. It was pure propaganda, brilliantly disguised as objective history. He was crafting his own myth in real time, controlling how millions of people saw him. It's the ancient equivalent of a leader controlling every headline, every image, every narrative about himself, flooding the public with a flattering story until people can't tell where the truth ends and the legend begins. And it worked. To the people of Rome, Caesar wasn't a warlord slaughtering 1 million people. He was a hero, a genius, the greatest Roman who had ever lived. But while Caesar was becoming a legend in Gaul, the fragile alliance holding the Republic together was falling apart. And the point of no return was rushing toward him. First, one leg of the 3-man pact simply vanished. Crassus, the immensely rich financier, grew jealous of the military glory Caesar and Pompey enjoyed. Desperate for his own battlefield triumph, he launched a war against the powerful Parthian Empire in the east. It was a disaster. His army was lured into the desert and annihilated. Crassus himself was killed, and with him died the money that had helped balance the Triumvirate. The stool now had only 2 legs, and those 2 legs were beginning to hate each other. Because with Crassus gone, there was nothing left to hold Caesar and Pompey together. They had once been allies, even family. Pompey had married Caesar's beloved daughter. But she had died, and the personal bond between them died with her. Now they were simply the 2 most powerful men in the world. And the world wasn't big enough for both. Pompey, the old hero of Rome, increasingly aligned himself with the Senate, with the conservative aristocrats who feared and despised Caesar's growing power and his popularity with the common people. They looked at Caesar's private army, his mountains of Gallic gold, his godlike fame, and they saw exactly what Sulla had seen in the defiant teenager decades before: a man who could destroy the Republic and make himself king. So they moved against him. As Caesar's command in Gaul neared its end, the Senate issued its ultimatum. It came down to a brutal, impossible choice. They ordered Caesar to give up his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Lay down your legions, come home unarmed, or be declared an enemy of the state. Now, here's why this was a death sentence dressed up as a lawful order. Caesar had made countless enemies. The moment he set foot in Rome without his army protecting him, those enemies would drag him into court, strip him of everything, exile him, or simply have him killed, perfectly legally. He'd watched Sulla post those killing lists. He knew exactly how legal murder worked in Rome. To obey the Senate meant political death, and very possibly literal death. But to refuse meant civil war. It meant turning his loyal legions against Rome itself, becoming the very thing Romans feared most, a general marching on his own homeland. It meant betraying everything the Republic stood for. Caesar stood at the edge of an empire, at the head of an army that loved him, facing a Senate that wanted him destroyed, with no good options left. He was trapped by the very system he'd spent his life climbing. Lay down power and die, or seize it all and shatter the Republic forever. And so we come to one of the most famous moments in all of human history. A cold January night in the year 49 BC. There was a small, unremarkable river in northern Italy called the Rubicon. On the surface it was nothing. A shallow, narrow stream you could probably wade across. But it marked a sacred boundary. It was the line separating Caesar's province from Italy proper. And Roman law was absolute. No general was permitted to bring his army across that line. To do so was treason. To cross the Rubicon with soldiers was to declare war on Rome itself. Caesar arrived at the riverbank with a single legion, and there, according to the ancient sources, he paused. Even Caesar, bold, ruthless, ambitious Caesar, hesitated at the edge of that little stream. He is said to have understood the enormity of what he was about to do, to have recognized that once he stepped across, there was no going back. For himself, for his enemies, for Rome, everything would change forever. And then he crossed. As he led his men over that tiny river, tradition tells us he uttered 3 immortal words. The die is cast. The dice have been thrown. There's no taking them back now. Whatever fate the gods had in store, it was set in motion. The gamble of his life, the same reckless, all-in gamble he'd made with his debts, his defiance, his entire career, was now made with the fate of the Republic itself. The moment his soldiers' boots touched the far bank, the Roman Republic, already sick and cracking for a century, received its mortal wound. Civil war was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The most powerful men in the world were about to turn Rome's own legions against each other, and the winner would hold the fate of the Mediterranean in his hands. In Rome, the news struck like a thunderbolt. Pompey, the great hero, the conqueror of the East, realized he could not stop Caesar in time, and he made a shocking decision. He abandoned the city. He fled, dragging much of the Senate with him, running from the man he'd once called family. Caesar was now marching south, and the two greatest soldiers Rome had ever produced were on a collision course that would decide everything, chasing each other across the ancient world toward a single field in Greece where the future of Western civilization would be settled in a single, blood-soaked afternoon. What followed was not one battle, but a war that stretched across the entire known world. Caesar chased his enemies the way a wildfire chases dry grass, relentless, fast, and utterly unstoppable. Pompey had fled Italy across the Adriatic Sea to Greece, but Caesar didn't simply follow him there. First, he turned west towards Spain, where Pompey's loyal legions were waiting. Because Caesar understood something his enemies didn't. You don't chase the head of the snake while the body is still armed behind you. In Spain, at a place called Ilerda, Caesar performed one of the great campaigns of his career, cornering Pompey's armies not with slaughter, but with maneuver, cutting off their water and supplies until they surrendered without a proper battle. Then he wheeled back east, ready to face Pompey himself. Try to picture the sheer physical scale of this. There were no cars, no trains, no planes. These were tens of thousands of men, marching on foot across mountains, fording rivers, crossing seas in wooden ships at the mercy of winter storms, moving from Italy to Spain and back, then across the sea to Greece, and eventually all the way to Egypt. The Roman world spanned 3 continents, and Caesar was hurling armies across all of it in pursuit of a single man. It was a war fought on a stage larger than anything in human history to that point. Imagine a conflict today that begins in one country and rages across 3 continents within a couple of years, with the same 2 leaders always at its center. That was the scope of Rome tearing itself apart. Everything came down to one field in northern Greece, near a town called Pharsalus, in the summer of 48 BC. The numbers tell you just how desperate Caesar's position really was. Pompey commanded a massive army, by ancient accounts roughly double the size of Caesar's force. Pompey had the men, the supplies, the cavalry, and the confidence of the Senate behind him. Caesar's legions were smaller and hungrier, but they were the veterans of Gaul, the hardened comrades who had followed him across the Rubicon and would follow him into hell. Pompey's plan seemed brilliant on paper. He had a huge advantage in cavalry, and he massed them on one wing, intending to smash through Caesar's horsemen, sweep around the side, and crush Caesar's outnumbered legions from behind. It was the obvious move, and it should have worked. But Caesar saw it coming. In a moment of pure tactical genius, he hid a special reserve force of his toughest infantry behind his own cavalry, out of sight. He gave them an unusual order, not to throw their javelins as spears, the normal Roman tactic, but to hold them and thrust them upward, straight at the faces of Pompey's cavalry. When Pompey's magnificent horsemen charged, they broke through as expected. And then Caesar's hidden reserve rose up and drove their weapons at the faces of the young aristocratic riders. These were vain young noblemen, and the sources tell us they panicked at the thought of their faces being ruined. Whether from fear of disfigurement or simply the shock of the assault, the cavalry charge collapsed into chaos. The proud horsemen fled the field, and the moment they broke, Caesar's reserve wheeled around and slammed into the exposed flank of Pompey's infantry. The entire battle turned in an instant. Pompey, the great Pompey, conqueror of the East, The man once considered the finest general alive watched his brilliant plan disintegrate. And here the sources give us a haunting image. Pompey, it said, simply walked back to his tent and sat down, stunned, as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The hero of Rome, paralyzed, while his army was slaughtered around him. When the enemy finally broke into his camp, he tore off the insignia of a general and fled on horseback, a broken man running from the ruin of everything he'd built. Pharsalus was over. Caesar had won the world in a single afternoon. But the war wasn't quite finished, because Pompey was still alive, still running. He fled east once more, this time to Egypt, an ancient, wealthy kingdom that had long been a Roman client state. Pompey expected sanctuary there. He had helped the ruling dynasty in the past. He believed the boy king of Egypt owed him his protection. He was catastrophically wrong. The Egyptian court did the political math. Pompey was a defeated fugitive, and Caesar was the new master of the Roman world. Sheltering a loser would only anger the winner. So as Pompey's small boat approached the Egyptian shore, and as he prepared to step onto land, the men sent to greet him drew their weapons and murdered him on the spot, in full view of his wife, watching helplessly from the ship. They cut off his head. When Caesar arrived in Egypt just days later, chasing his rival to the ends of the earth, the Egyptians presented him with a gift they thought would delight him: the severed head of Pompey the Great. And here the ancient sources tell us something remarkable. Caesar did not celebrate. He is said to have turned away and wept. Whether those tears were genuine grief for a former son-in-law and old ally, or a performance for the watching world, we'll never fully know. But the image is unforgettable. The head of Pompey, presented on foreign sand. The head of the man who had been Rome's greatest hero, reduced to a diplomatic trophy handed to his enemy. In that moment, an entire era of Roman history ended. The old republic had produced titans like Pompey, men who won glory and served the state within its rules. That world was now, quite literally, dead on a beach. There was no rival left standing. There was only Caesar. And so Caesar returned to Rome, holding power no Roman had ever held before. The Republic had always had emergency safeguards. In times of crisis, it could appoint a dictator, a single man given absolute authority, but only for 6 months. Then he had to step down. It was a fire extinguisher, meant to be used briefly and put away. Caesar took that fire extinguisher and made it permanent. He had himself named dictator for 1 year, then for 10 years, and finally, in early 44 BC, dictator for life. Dictator perpetuo. Forever. A temporary emergency power stretched into a lifetime rule. It's the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook, one we've watched play out again and again across the centuries. The leader who takes emergency powers just for now, and then simply never gives them back. The crisis never quite ends, and the temporary grip becomes a permanent chokehold. But Caesar went further, and this is what truly terrified his enemies. He began to blur the line between a powerful man and a god king. His face, a living man's face, appeared on Roman coins. This had never happened before. Roman coins honored gods and dead ancestors, not the living. Now, everywhere money changed hands, Romans held Caesar's portrait in their palms. His statues were erected among those of the gods. Special honors, titles, and privileges were heaped upon him until he stood not as one citizen among equals, but as something towering above the entire state. And the Senate, That proud body of aristocrats that had governed Rome for 5 centuries became a kind of theater. Its members still met, still debated, still voted, but everyone understood the performance for what it was. Real power flowed from one man. The Senate had become a stage where free government was still acted out, even though the audience knew it was only a play. It looked like the Republic, it sounded like the Republic, but it was hollow. Now, in fairness, Caesar was not simply hoarding power for its own sake. He was, by many measures, a brilliant and energetic reformer. He tackled the crushing debt crisis that was strangling ordinary Romans, offering relief that eased their burdens without wiping out the wealthy entirely. He resettled thousands of his loyal veterans and the urban poor onto land across the empire, giving the landless a future. He launched enormous building projects and expanded citizenship to people beyond Italy. And he gave the world a gift we still use every single day. The old Roman calendar was a chaotic mess, drifting out of sync with the seasons because officials manipulated it for political gain. Caesar reformed it completely, creating a calendar based on the solar year of 365 days, with a leap year every 4 years. The Julian calendar. It's the direct ancestor of the calendar hanging on your wall right now. The month of July is named in his honor. Every time you check today's date, you are, in a small way, still living inside Caesar's reform. So, here was the dilemma that split Rome down the middle. Caesar was competent. He was popular with the masses. He got things done. And he was, by any honest reading, dismantling 500 years of self-government and turning himself into a king in all but name. And to the Roman aristocracy, no crime was greater than that. The word king, rex, was poison in Rome. Ever since they'd expelled Tarquin the Proud centuries before, the very idea of a king was the ultimate betrayal of everything Rome stood for. Which brings us to one of the most famous scenes in ancient history. At a public festival, Caesar's close ally, Mark Antony, approached him before the crowd and offered him a royal crown, a diadem, the symbol of kingship. Twice Antony offered it, and twice Caesar pushed it away. Each time he refused, the crowd roared its approval. Was it a genuine rejection of monarchy? Or was it a carefully staged piece of political theater? A way to test the public and demonstrate his humility, while everyone knew he already held a king's power. Historians still debate it, but to the men who feared him most, the meaning was clear enough. Caesar hadn't taken the crown, but he'd let the whole city watch a crown being offered to him. And that was enough. They were now certain, sooner or later, this man would make himself king. So they decided to kill him. The conspiracy that formed against Caesar drew together some 60 senators, but 2 men stood at its heart. The first was Brutus, and his involvement is what gives this story its tragic weight. Brutus was, by all accounts, a genuine idealist, a man of philosophy and principle who believed deeply in the Republic and its ancient liberties. His own family legend traced back to the very man who had helped expel Rome's last king centuries before. And here's the painful part. Caesar loved Brutus. He had spared Brutus after Pharsalus, forgiven him, promoted him, treated him almost like a son. Brutus was persuaded that killing the man who loved him was a sacred duty to save Rome from tyranny. The second man was Cassius, sharper, angrier, more driven by resentment and personal ambition. Cassius was the engine of the plot, the one who worked relentlessly to draw others in, and above all to recruit the respected Brutus. Because the conspirators knew that with Brutus among them, the murder would look like a noble act of liberation, rather than mere jealousy. The date they chose has become legendary. The Ides of March, the 15th in the year 44 BC. Caesar was warned, according to the sources, an ominous prophecy, unsettling omens, even a note pressed into his hand that he never read. He brushed it all aside. He had dismissed his personal bodyguard, believing that a ruler feared by everyone had nothing to fear, and that fear of assassination was a miserable way to live. As Caesar entered a meeting of the Senate, the conspirators gathered around him under the pretense of presenting a petition. Then the knives came out. They struck him again and again. According to tradition, when Caesar saw his beloved Brutus among the attackers, blade in hand, he spoke his final words, the words that have echoed for 2,000 years as the ultimate expression of betrayal. Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus? And then, the sources tell us, he stopped resisting. He pulled his robe over his face and let it happen. He was stabbed 23 times. The most powerful man in the world, the conqueror of Gaul, the victor of Pharsalus, the dictator for life, bleeding to death on the floor of the Senate, at the feet of the very institution he had emptied of power, killed by the men he had forgiven and trusted. The assassins ran into the streets, holding up their bloody daggers, crying out that Rome was free, that they had killed the tyrant and restored the Republic. They could not have been more wrong. Because here is the terrible, final irony of this entire story, the lesson that echoes down through every century since. The Republic was not a machine you could restart by removing one man. It was already dead. Caesar hadn't killed it in a single stroke. He had been the symptom of a system that had been rotting for 100 years. The inequality, the private armies, the men who put personal power above the state. Killing Caesar didn't fix any of that. It just removed the one man strong enough to hold the chaos together. What followed was not freedom. It was more war. The assassins, celebrated as liberators one day, were hunted and destroyed the next. Mark Antony and Caesar's young heir, a teenager named Octavian, Caesar's adopted grandnephew, turned the full fury of Caesar's loyal legions and the outraged Roman masses against the killers. Brutus and Cassius were defeated and died by their own hands. And then, inevitably, the victors turned on each other, plunging the Roman world into yet another round of civil war. When the smoke finally cleared, one man was left standing. That teenager, Octavian, would grow into Augustus, Rome's first emperor. He learned the great lesson of his adoptive father's death perfectly. He never called himself king. He never called himself dictator. He kept the Senate, kept the elections, kept all the comforting old forms of the Republic in place. He simply held all the real power quietly, permanently, behind the facade. He gave Rome the appearance of the old freedom while making sure it could never return. And the Republic that men had murdered Caesar to save was gone forever, replaced by 5 centuries of emperors. So the men who stabbed Caesar to preserve liberty ended up handing Rome to an emperor. They killed the man, and in doing so, they killed the very thing they were trying to protect. That's the haunting truth at the heart of this story. Democracies and republics rarely die from a single blow by a single villain. They erode slowly, through inequality that goes unaddressed, through leaders who bend the rules just this once, through a public that cheers for the strong man because he's charming, because he gets things done, because he promises to fix everything. By the time a Caesar crosses the Rubicon, the real damage was done years before, quietly, while everyone was watching the spectacle. Julius Caesar didn't destroy the Republic alone. He was simply the man ruthless enough, brilliant enough, and lucky enough to be standing there when it finally fell, with half of Rome applauding as it did. If this story made you see history, and maybe even the world around you, a little differently, then do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. This is exactly the kind of story we tell here. The real forces that shape power, told the way they actually happened. Hit that subscribe button, and let's keep uncovering how the past explains the present together.